Welcome to the Workforces Podcast. I'm Julian Alsid.
And I'm Caitlin Lemoyne, and we speak with innovators who are shaping the future of work and learning.
Together, we unpack the complex elements of workforce and career preparation and offer practical solutions that can be scaled and sustained.
This podcast is an outgrowth of our Workforces consulting practice. Through weekly discussions, we seek to share the trends and themes we see in our work and amplify impactful efforts happening in higher education, industry, and workforce development all across the country. We are grateful to Lumina Foundation for its past support during the initial development and launch of this podcast and invite future sponsors of this effort. Please check out our Workforces Podcast website to learn more. And so with that, let's dive in. In our recent Workforces episodes, we've looked at the future of work through different lenses, from the technical infrastructure of credentials to the institutional shifts happening at community colleges and national nonprofits. And today, we're continuing our focus on the innovators who are driving these changes by looking specifically at the role of investment in the work and learning ecosystem.
While we often talk about policy and systemic shifts, it's equally important to understand how private capital and exited operators or founders who've successfully built and sold their own companies are identifying and scaling the next generation of solutions, particularly as artificial intelligence begins to fundamentally reshape how we prepare the workforce.
And our guest today brings a unique perspective as both a successful entrepreneur and venture capitalist. Miriam Altman-Reyes is the founding managing partner of Brass Ring Ventures, an exited operator-led seed fund and growth studio. Miriam and her team focus on investing in AI-driven solutions that prepare learners and workers for a rapidly evolving labor market.
Miriam is an expert in the industry who's experienced the full life cycle of a social impact startup. She was the co-founder and CEO of Kinvolved, which she led from its inception to a successful acquisition by PowerSchool in 2022. Her leadership has been recognized by many, including Forbes 30 Under 30 and the New York Times, and she maintains a deep commitment to driving economic mobility for underrepresented populations.
Miriam, your path from being a public school teacher in New York City to leading a venture fund gives you an incredible perspective on how to best support innovators and solve for the challenges ahead across learning, work, and economic mobility. We are very excited to have you with us. Welcome to this podcast.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Yes, Miriam, welcome. And so we've talked a little bit about your background, but we'd love to hear in your own words about your journey, the path that led you to found and lead Brass Ring Ventures.
So I moved to New York right out of college almost 20 years ago. Amazing to say, hard to believe, to initially start a career in education. I moved to the city to teach in a public high school through a program called Teach for America, where I witnessed firsthand many different challenges facing our education system. But the one that really stuck with me because it was just so foundational was student absenteeism. You know, kids would miss school for a variety of reasons, but at the end of the day, you know, as I think we all know, if you don't show up, it's very hard to be successful in whatever it is we're trying to achieve. And I think of my time in the classroom as really kind of trying to understand some of the underlying challenges behind student absenteeism and the opportunities to solve for it. And I found from an operational perspective that there are really two parts of the challenge that I felt that eventually technology could help solve. One was that educators, administrators, parents, and students themselves didn't have access to data to really help understand what's going on and therefore inform interventions to solve the problems. And then two, that those stakeholder groups were really not able to be in close and regular communication to help ideally even prevent absenteeism from happening in the first place because of just a really broken communication sort of system between school and home. So I left the classroom having sort of thought of the challenge. I'd certainly witnessed the challenge, thought of some of the solution possibilities. I actually left the classroom thinking I was going to start a school as I entered into my graduate degree at NYU's Wagner School of Public Service. And in the first 2 weeks of the program, ended up pivoting to starting an education technology company. And eventually that company offered a platform of multiple tools that did just what I just described, providing more real-time access to data and facilitating two-way communication between school and home, really heavily focused on underserved populations where student absenteeism tends to be most profound. And so I led as one of the co-founders and the CEO of the business over the course of about 8 years, from, of course, idea through eventually our exit, as you've mentioned in your earlier comments. Many different chapters along the way, but, and lots of highs and lows, as with any entrepreneurial business. But maybe some of the highlights are that we, first of all, from an efficacy perspective, achieved positive results from 3 third-party efficacy studies that really showed that our solution did, in fact, work at reducing absenteeism, which therefore had impacts on short and long-term academic gains, including graduation. Also, we became a profitable business, even though we did raise financing over the years from a number of different sources, from venture capital to debt financing to strategic sources, grants and others. We did become profitable before we were acquired. And we were a business that sold our software to arguably one of the hardest, buyers that exist. That's K-12 schools and districts across the U.S. And at the time of our acquisition, we had customers from small rural districts to New York City public schools across about half of U.S. states. So it was a really great run, and super proud of the work that we did. I then stayed on at PowerSchool, who had acquired us, which then had recently gone public. We were their second acquisition as a publicly traded company, as primarily in the role of vice president of go-to-market strategy and partnerships for their new solutions group, which essentially was spun up around the time of our own company's acquisition, with the goal being to help develop more sort of organic growth to help offset a lot of the acquisition-related growth that PowerSchool had become famous for over many years. And so I reported into the chief product officer and worked on launching 4 products across the entire ecosystem of PowerSchool's, I think maybe 25 to 30 products in total. So really got that much broader perspective after having been so specifically focused on building my own business and my own problem set for many years. And that was certainly by opportunity and also by design. But ultimately, I decided that I really wanted to be closer to the early stage, closer to the ground and closer to the impact, and also had, the entrepreneurial spirit in some ways never dies. And so I knew I wanted to start something new again. And so I left PowerSchool just about 3 years ago to start Brassring Ventures, with the initial idea being that as a founder, I had incredible mentors, advisors, and board members who were exited founders and operators in their own right. And they knew exactly the right time to provide support, how to provide support, how to push, and also how to let me sort of like lead and learn as a first-time CEO. And I realized in talking with dozens of other founders that were earlier in their journey that experience that I'd had was particularly unique. And I also was really fortunate that I had a team of exited operators and founders in my last business's executive team that wanted to work together again. And so we came back together as partners in Brassring Ventures, both the studio and now in the fund. I'm sure we'll go into more, but that is a little bit of how I got to where I am today.
What a cool and amazing story. And certainly can see how you draw upon so many of your lessons learned across your 8 years, I think you said, in that kind of startup space. I'm curious, you started to go to speaking more about the importance of having coaching or mentorship as you were designing, a new venture. And so I'm curious to dig a little bit more there and talk about, what specific challenges in the future of work and learning is Brassring Ventures looking to solve through both the investment strategy and also the growth studio.
So over the, last 3 years of working with several dozen companies at this point, into which we've invested in a handful, and that number will continue to grow as we continue to have additional capital deployed through our fund. We've identified 4 core themes that we're, looking to support both through the studio, and then the studio really is a mechanism to feed into the investment fund. So they sort of go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And so we invest across the life cycle of the learner, as we describe it. So everything from early childhood through K-12 age learners, through higher ed and sort of alternative pathways, and even into workforce and adult learning. So the idea being sort of helping people continue to improve and, gain access to new opportunities in the professional, and ultimately economic opportunity and mobility, which is sort of the overarching theme of what we're looking for in our fund from both an impact and a financial return perspective. So those 4 themes sort of align to those age segments are first what we call early success systems. So those are technologies that are helping prepare our youngest citizens and early learners for their first formal schooling experience, and or solutions that are helping parents and caregivers access quality, affordable childcare, which then in turn has a really important impact on workforce retention as well. There's lots of data and studies out there showing, particularly for women, but not exclusively women, that there's many people who are leaving the workforce because they're just finding that the sort of cost trade-offs are not there to kind of stay in the workforce. That's the first theme that we're investing in. Second are solutions that are really helping drive operational efficiency for some of these more bureaucratic institutions like K-12, like higher education, even into sort of workforce corporate environments, helping these institutions do more with less, primarily leveraging AI, in ways that really work for them and can drive more productivity and efficiency as budgets in some ways are getting, shifted and constrained. Third are solutions that are more learner focused, that are helping learners develop what we call social capital skills. And that would encompass skills and tools that are helping people develop like emotional intelligence, social emotional connectivity, communication skills, things like creative thinking, problem solving, critical thinking, all these things that, AI is not going to replace, and arguably that the worker today and tomorrow needs to be even more adept in as AI becomes more of a solution to replace some of the rote skills that are, existing, especially in entry level or even mid-level jobs. And then fourth are solutions that are helping upskill and reskill both the current and the future workforce, which is very aligned to that third theme. So we're really excited. And again, these themes are both aligned to what we've seen as our work, working by working hands-on with companies in these different areas, but also really validated by the research much more broadly that shows that these are areas that are not only impactful to society as a whole, as we're seeing these like major shifts and we're just at the tip of the iceberg, but also are going to drive, financial return, really kind of that doing well by doing good concept that I wholeheartedly believe in.
Wow, that's a pretty broad mandate you've given yourself there, Miriam. So given where you sit now as CEO and managing partner, what are some of the most exciting innovations that you're seeing in the early stage ed tech work and in the market more broadly? We'd love to hear some specific examples.
So we just invested our first fund investment in a company called Dewey, which is basically pulling together data from many disparate systems and making it immediately actionable and sort of helping inform decisions both in the K-12 and higher ed for the institutional kind of buyer and user. So they fit nicely into that operational efficiency theme that I'd mentioned is one that we're looking to invest in. Really, interesting company, have a number of partnerships that they developed early on that have really helped them drive growth and expansion, as well as working directly with schools and districts. And so we think there's really high potential for Dewey, and companies like that in the sector. And that's why we were excited to make our first investment in them. We're looking at a company as well that we're excited about that I probably can't name by name, but it maybe is illustrative of some of what we're seeing, that is developing, similarly kind of AI workflows and supports both training and upskilling, as well as for example, financial management capabilities for small business owners. Small business, represents more than half of our workforce and continues to grow, especially as, again, sort of the corporate workforce is changing and people are looking for different types of working dynamics and environments and opportunities. But a lot of small business owners are not necessarily like CFOs by background, right? And so there's a huge opportunity to help them really build bigger and more successful and sustainable businesses through leveraging tools like this, and then also help skill and upskill and reskill their employees as well. So those are a couple of examples. There's also a number of companies, one that I did an angel investment in, several others we're looking at that are more in like the social capital development space. So there's a company called Hive Class that is basically has a sort of full spectrum solution for both mental and physical health and wellness for K-12 specifically, as at least a starting point, which is really unique. There's a lot of kind of social emotional development and mental health content and platforms that are available to K-12. There's less in the physical education space, but maybe some competitors, but there's really no one who's bringing the physical and the mental health together, which is, again, really foundational. If you don't have your physical and mental health as a baseline, it's very hard for students to be successful in school and therefore to build the habits that ensure that they're successful, longer term as they become employees into the workforce. So there are so many companies. I mean, I look at, dozens of companies in a week and sometimes even in a day, but that gives you an idea of some that I think are really exciting on the market.
So you mentioned, Miriam, the impact of AI on your work and how you're thinking more about, what are the uniquely human skills that we can all help to build in a time and space where AI is perhaps doing the more rote work more readily, but there are these unique human capabilities. Just curious to hear how your work has shifted even over the last few years around the technology piece of how you think about your investment strategy, because I would imagine there's some shifting that happens and continues to happen, I'm sure, across your work, but that's one area that when you mentioned it, I was like, oh, let's talk more about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really exciting time, I think. Certainly there's a level of uncertainty in times like today's, but I think I'm extremely excited. Just thinking only in just the last 3 years, even though, if we just start there, right, since we started Brass Ring, I think, the kinds of companies, the access to development of technology and like the ability to invest in R&D with, limited resources is so much broader than it used to be, at least to get kind of initial ideas developed and out the door. You don't need to hire a full engineering team at that stage, right? And then as a business continues to evolve and grow, you can get so much more out of a smaller engineering team today than you could even 5 years ago, because these engineering teams themselves are using AI tools, for example, to help facilitate the development of the products that they're building, which, of course, again, if we're talking about operational efficiency, it helps them, do more in fewer hours than they ever could have done, before without these kinds of tools. So I think, access to technical talent at a reasonable price is definitely expanding. There's obviously the flip side where people are raising huge amounts of money in certain, sectors and industries and investing tremendous amounts in technology development as well. If we're thinking really specifically about our sectors and sort of the stage businesses we're in, I think it's really largely a really positive outcome we've seen. I think the flip side is that because it is so much easier for anyone to kind of develop technology, to some degree or another at least, the defensibility of technology is something that we scrutinize a lot more than we used to. We always did, but it's just something you have to look at much more carefully and closely. What is the real moat for the solution? How do we know that some of these bigger players are not going to be able to, easily displace the existing solutions? And also these bigger players are paying a lot more attention to education and workforce facing technology than they ever had before. The Googles of the world had ed tech, but arguably are investing a lot more in really influencing and building tools to help shift how school operates and how the workforce operates in a way that they weren't doing, 5, 10, 15 years ago. That's just a lot more attention paid. So the competitive risks are much higher. So, that's an interesting dynamic that we're seeing as well. And just the proliferation of technologies out there as well, right? Like where there may have been, 10 upskilling and reskilling solutions 10 years ago, now there's 100 or 1,000. And so again, just being able to, for founders and these companies to be able to get a chunk of the market early, and B, differentiate and really communicate their unique value proposition, and also, their team's unique perspective and skill set and lived experience and how it sets them apart and sets them ahead is more important today, I think, than it, ever has been in the past. So those are a couple of things that we're, noticing. I think people talk a lot about valuations as well in venture, when it comes to AI-driven solutions. I think, in certain industries, we've seen, valuations go all over the map. I think in future of learning work, generally, they've been fairly right-sized, which I think is good for the industry overall, and, not extremely overpriced, frankly, which I think just sets these companies, founders, and their investors up for longer-term success as we navigate what the future looks like as well.
So Brass Ring Ventures takes, as I understand it, you take a pretty hands-on approach with your portfolio of companies, and be really interesting to hear you talk a little about the sort of hurdles, the common hurdles that you see founders face building there for the future of work, but also how do you help them address these challenges and scale? I mean, you gave us a little taste of what it was like for you going through the trials and tribulations of startup land. How do you keep them all sane?
I'll answer that in a few parts. First of all, the most common things that we see founders need are right out the gate, our support with sales and go-to-market, just increasing their revenue, figuring out their revenue operations, talent acquisition, et cetera, everything, their narrative, their presentation, everything that's sort of tied to top line, growing the business. Tied to that is also making sure that the retention of existing customers is also strong and there's an opportunity for expansion. So that sort of whole bucket, I would say, is revenue and growth. And that usually is number one, even if there are different flavors as to like what kinds of things that founders need help with. And where I personally have a background in, sales and go-to-market, just from sort of learning on the fly, nothing formalized in my like professional training, or at least schooling training, I guess, but just sort of like lived experience. And we have several members of our team, including an operating partner focused on growth, who's served in several leadership capacities, who together we take a really hands-on role with founders on that particular sort of area. The second, I would say, is everything related to kind of, cash flow operations, financial management, and fundraising. Those kind of all go hand in hand to some degree. We find a lot of times that founders in our sector, future of learning and work, come in with incredible lived experience, and you can't teach lived experience. So to me, that's incredibly important, but very little business experience, business acumen. And so the good news is that you can teach those kinds of skills, right? Like how to review financial statements, how to create financial projections that are, based in realistic assumptions, how to execute against those, how to adjust and scenario plan if you don't hit your revenue target, right? Like, how do you make sure that the company can continue to sustain itself? How do you model in fundraises, right? Like, when's the right time to fundraise? How much should you fundraise? From whom should you fundraise? What should the valuation of your fundraise be? What are the KPIs and milestones you need to hit along the way to warrant a fundraise? So there's so many different pieces of the puzzle that come together, all related to the financial side. And so our lead operating partner, who's also on our investment committee, Sumit Singh, is in charge of that work. And he and I, work really closely together as well. But he's kind of our numbers guy and a de facto kind of a fractional CFO. So we see those areas initially as areas of support that founders most often need. And then for myself, a lot of what I'm a generalist, so I touch a lot of different things, but a lot of like leadership development as well, helping founders kind of put a mirror up, understand, how they're, coming across internally, externally, how to strengthen their own narratives and ensure that they're able to get their goals achieved. And communication is just so critically part of that. And also just how you lead and manage these different stakeholder groups, not just employees, but your customers. If your customer has a frustrating experience, how are you coaching your team and how to respond to that? So many different examples like that, right? Like board communications and management, and sort of generating positive results from, board engagement is another, really common topic that I find myself supporting founders on. So those are kind of the initial areas. And then I mentioned a couple of our operating partners, but essentially our model is that we have 7 operating partners outside of myself, each of whom have gone through, most of them were on my former executive team, as I mentioned before. So we've got a really great track record of working together. And most of them had served in some capacity in leadership through at least one other acquisition across the sector, if not 2 or 3 in some cases, really just like an incredibly seasoned and active operating team, not people who retired 10 years ago and are like sort of, meeting with founders like ad hoc once a month. Like we're meeting with founders usually at least once a week in some capacity when we're working with them, and sometimes more often than that. So really rolling up our sleeves and supporting them. Our model is typically that pre-investment, we work with founders in what we call our sort of a phase 1, like more of an advisory capacity. We're getting to know founders, getting to know their businesses. They're also getting to know us and ensuring that they feel that there's strong value add. And our goal is to come to a decision typically in, ranges in terms of the time frame, but anywhere between like 3 and 6 months on average as to whether it makes sense to invest or not. And again, also opening that door to the founder themselves to make sure they feel that we're a good fit before we get into a long-term relationship, which is what making an investment ends up being. And then post-investment, we usually invest at the seed stage. So typically when companies are like $500,000 to roughly $3 million in annual revenue, sort of how we define that on a very simple kind of metrics, revenue metrics basis. Post that round of investment, we'll go even deeper as fractional executives, really helping professionalize the organization, with the idea being that we're helping each kind of department function clean up a bit, prepare to bring in, full-time staff and offboard our own team, and ultimately prepare for their first institutional fundraise, which is the Series A. And then in that Series A, if things have gone well, then we'll do follow on as well and continue to support the business in that way. So it's there's nuance to everything. And there's certainly like an acceleration component to it. People often are like, is this an accelerator? Is it a venture studio? It's neither of those. That's why we've called it this growth studio, because it's something a little bit different, but it certainly pulls elements from both of those, really with the goal being to, again, sort of help provide that exit operator guidance and expertise that many investors just don't have, to founders that goes beyond just, providing capital to the business and helping them grow.
Yeah, I could see that sort of support being invaluable. So like each of those stages is so distinct and the needs become, I feel like they change almost before your eyes, right? Like we're just putting this together. It's a startup. Wait a minute. Here's this whole other bucket of things we never even thought we'd have to do. And now what do we do? And so I can imagine that your hands-on approach and focus on being a growth studio really resonates for a lot of founders, because it's like you don't really know what the challenges are till you're in it, right? Like
exactly.
Until you're kind of looking around that corner, you can't always anticipate what the challenges are going to be.
Absolutely. Yep. That's a big value.
So Miriam, what's a piece of practical advice or a couple pieces of practical advice that you would offer our listeners, whether they come from more of an investor space or as educators or entrepreneurs, to help them become forces in navigating labor market shifts, or, like you can take it in the direction of navigating changes as you're running an organization, whether it's small or large. I will let you decide where you want to take your reply.
Yeah. I mean, I think, back to like some of our investment themes, honestly, I think leaders at any type of organization, whether it's a startup or a large entity or a school or, a consultancy, whatever your sort of work is, and wherever you are, frankly, in the hierarchy, I think adaptability is so critical, and that social capital is so important. Having a network of people that you can, go to both continue to build relationships, get a, sense of what's going on in the industry from their unique perspectives. What are the opportunities? What are the things that you should look out for? What are the skills that you should be developing? What experiences that you should be, garnering, et cetera. For example, I think that that's really, really critical. And so again, just sort of, having that social capital, developing those social emotional skills, that social capital, and being able to be adaptable in, today's market. And honestly, I think the market for many years to come is going to be a requirement for people to be successful and continue to kind of stay ahead of what's going on. And not be caught flat-footed. So, that just takes, critical thinking skills and problem-solving skills and, having the headspace as well to take a step back and sort of understand what's happening both at a micro and a macro level. So it's a lot of different moving pieces. But I think, again, that advice I would give to founders, but I would give to people in a lot of different areas of the economy, frankly, policymakers as well. I think that's really important. And then I think the other thing, more from like a team management perspective, is it has never been more important, even though I think it's always been important to find people that are incredibly mission aligned, whatever it is that you're trying to do, right? What's like the end outcome or end goal of what you're working on, what you're building, what you're developing, the policies you're implementing, et cetera. And ultimately, are the people mission aligned and truly passionate about the same, solving that challenge? Because hopefully, again, to one of those themes that, we're investing in, as things change and shift, people will have the opportunity to upskill and reskill. But what you can't teach is passion, right? You can't teach someone how to care about something and give them experiences, but whether it's going to resonate with them or not is not a teachable thing. And so that's always something that I would suggest, certainly looking for. It's an exciting time, but it's definitely a time to keep your head on a swivel and, just keep paying attention to what's going on and try to kind of stay ahead of the curve as much as you can.
And do you consult consulting firms? No, just kidding. We're, this is our welcome to our lives. It's, I think, and we know we're not alone because we talk with a lot of people, but it is a world, and, it was always challenging starting a business. And I think, this world now is a world in flux.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we get requests, to support lots of different kinds of organizations and entities, frankly, some of which we don't have the ability to say yes to because, that's just a little bit outside of our like wheelhouse. But, nonprofits are dealing with, these same challenges, for-profits, early stage businesses, later stage businesses, PE owned companies, public. I mean, it's just everyone is trying to figure this out in their own flavor. And I think like ultimately the skills and sort of attributes as a leader that you need are similar. Just how you apply them might be slightly different in each context.
Yeah, so true. Yeah. So Miriam, thank you so much for taking the time there's been really great conversation and soaking it all in. How can our listeners continue to follow your work and, your initiatives?
Yeah, thank you for asking. We're both through Brass Ring Ventures page as well as through my own page. We're very active on LinkedIn, also on Instagram. I would say those are the two kind of social channels to where you can find us. So it's brassring.bc is our website. You can also find more information there on us. And then my name is Miriam Altman-Reyes with a hyphen. You can find me on LinkedIn or Instagram, like I said. And then for founders in particular who are looking, for potential investment opportunity or support through our Growth Studio, by going to our website, you can find on the upper right corner and throughout the website access to apply to join our Growth Studio, which is a short, less than 10-minute application. And we'll, always review it and get back to founders always within a week or less.
That's great. Thank you so much for those very practical next steps and
Sure.
other practical next steps for our listeners as far as how to continue to follow or become involved perhaps with your great work. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, Miriam, and for sharing so many thoughts throughout this conversation. And we look forward to remaining in touch.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the conversation and the opportunity, and I also look forward to staying in touch.
We hope you enjoyed today's conversation and appreciate you tuning in to Workforces. Thank you to our listeners and guests for their ongoing support, and a special thanks to our producer, Dustin Ramsdell. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or want to check out more episodes, please visit workforces.info/podcast. You can also find Workforces wherever you regularly listen to your favorite podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you're interested in learning more about Workforces Consulting, please visit workforces.info/consulting for more details about our multi-service practice.